All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to kind of go behind the scenes on something you see all the time online, but probably don't think about too much. We're talking about gstatic.com.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's always kind of lurking in the background when you're using Google services, loading little bits and pieces. But today, we're going to pull back the curtain and see what it's all about.
And I know you might be thinking, oh, great, another technical deep dive.
Yeah.
But trust me on this one, because understanding gstatic.com, it's kind of like unlocking a secret about how the modern web actually works, how it manages to be so fast and so efficient. We've looked into a bunch of different angles here, like what exactly is it? How does it work? Why is it such a powerhouse when it comes to performance? And we even found some interesting connections to things like web scraping.
Yeah, and hopefully by the end of this deep dive, you'll walk away not just knowing what gstatic.com is, but really understanding its role in delivering content across the internet.
So where do we even begin with something like this? What's the best way to sort of break it down?
Well, at its core, gstatic.com is Google's content delivery network, or CDN for short. And, Google, they have a few services they run, right? Just a couple things like search and Gmail and YouTube.
Yeah, just a few small things.
Right, exactly. And all those services rely on a massive amount of static content. So we're talking about the stuff that doesn't change, the foundational elements, the things that make them, look the way they look and work the way they work. And that includes things like the code that makes buttons clickable, that's JavaScript.
Right.
Or the instructions that control the colors and the layout, that's CSS. And of course, all the images and fonts.
Right, all that good stuff that makes a website, well, a website.
Yeah.
So gstatic.com is specifically built to deal with this kind of content, right?
Yeah.
The static stuff, not the things that are constantly changing, like, say, your inbox or your personalized search results.
Exactly. gstatic.com is all about those unchanging elements, the pieces that can be used over and over again. And what's really interesting here is that because it's focused so specifically on static content, Google can optimize its infrastructure for that purpose. And that's where some really amazing efficiency comes in.
That makes a lot of sense. If you only have to worry about delivering one type of content, you can make things super streamlined.
Yeah.
But what does that infrastructure actually look like? What's going on behind the scenes to make all this happen?
So picture this. You've got a web that spans the entire globe, right?
Right.
And at the edges of this web, you have these things called edge nodes. Basically, they're servers, but strategically located all around the world. And the advantage for, the everyday user is speed. So when your browser needs a static file from a Google service, it's very likely going to grab it from an edge node that's closest to you geographically. And that makes a huge difference in terms of how fast that content reaches you.
That's clever. So it's all about bringing the content closer to the user, instead of making it travel halfway across the world.
Yeah.
That's probably a big part of why Google services feel so responsive. It's not just the code itself, it's where it's being served from.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we talk about static stuff, what kinds of things are we actually talking about? What's being delivered through gstatic.com?
Well, there's a lot of essentials in there. First, you've got the JavaScript libraries and frameworks. That's all the behind-the-scenes code that makes things interactive on websites. The stuff that makes menus drop down or image carousels work smoothly. Then you have CSS style sheets, which are basically the design instructions. They control things like text size, colors, background images, all that visual stuff.
It's like the language of web design. Got it.
Exactly. And of course, you've got images and icons. Those are a big one. And often they're optimized specifically for the device you're using, so you're not downloading a gigantic file on your phone if you don't need to. And let's not forget about web fonts. Those are the custom fonts that give websites their unique look.
All right, because using just the standard fonts would be pretty boring.
Totally. It's all about branding and visual identity these days. Even parts of the web page structure itself, little HTML components that get reused across different pages can be served through gstatic.com, and certain types of audio and video files optimized for specific purposes. Essentially, it's handling all those core building blocks that make up what you see and interact with online.
So that's a pretty big range of stuff it's taking care of, and it does it all so quickly. I know you mentioned caching earlier, which is a bit of a web performance buzzword. Can you explain how that works in the context of gstatic.com?
Yeah, caching is a big deal here. It's basically all about storing content in different places so it can be accessed more quickly. And gstatic.com uses a multi-layered approach to this. So first, you've got browser-level caching. Your web browser is actually pretty smart. Once it downloads a static file from gstatic.com, it will often store a copy of that file locally. So the next time you visit that website or another Google service that uses the same file, your browser doesn't have to download it again. It just grabs it from its own little storage.
That makes sense. It's like having a little library of web components right there on your computer.
Exactly. And it's not just random storage either. There are these things called intelligent expiration policies, which are basically rules that Google sets to tell your browser how long it should keep those files before checking if there's a newer version.
So it's not just storing things forever, it's keeping things fresh.
Right. And then we have regional edge caching. This is where those edge nodes we talked about come in. Those servers will often store copies of frequently accessed resources. So if a lot of people in your area are requesting the same JavaScript library, for example, it's likely to be sitting on a nearby edge node ready to go. And then there's origin caching, which basically helps to reduce the strain on Google's main origin servers. And they also have a cool system called dynamic cache invalidation. So if a file needs to be updated, Google can very quickly and efficiently tell all the caches around the world, hey, this old version's no good anymore, go get the new one.
Got it. It's like a giant coordinated system of web content libraries, constantly updating and making sure everyone has the latest versions. What happens, though, when things get really busy online? Like, imagine a major event is happening and everyone's rushing to Google for information. How does gstatic.com handle those huge spikes in traffic?
That's where load balancing comes in. So the system will automatically distribute incoming requests across multiple servers. If one server is getting slammed with traffic, it can share the load with others. So let's say there's a massive spike in people searching on Google. Load balancing will make sure that the traffic is spread out so no single server gets overwhelmed.
It's like a digital traffic cop directing all the data to where it needs to go.
Exactly. And this ability to spread the load also has another really important benefit called automatic failover. So let's say one of the servers actually has a problem and goes down. The system can instantly redirect traffic to other servers that are still working. And for the end user, you might not even notice anything happened. It's just seamless.
Wow. So it's not just about speed, it's about reliability as well. It can handle pretty much anything that comes its way. Speaking of handling things, security is a huge concern these days. What kind of protections does gstatic.com have in place?
Oh yeah, security is absolutely a top priority for Google. They have a number of things in place. DDoS mitigation, for one. That helps protect against those attacks where someone tries to flood a server with traffic and basically knock it offline.
Right, like those denial of service attacks you hear about.
Exactly. They also use SSL/TLS encryption. That makes sure the communication between your browser and the gstatic.com servers is secure and private. And then you've got content integrity verification. That helps make sure that the files you're receiving haven't been tampered with in transit.
Okay, so someone can't sneak in and change the code or swap an image for something else.
Right. And of course, there are access control mechanisms, basically ways of managing who can access and modify the content on the servers in the first place.
So it's like a fortress for web content with multiple layers of protection. That makes a lot of sense given how important this all is. Now, our source material highlights some pretty impressive statistics when it comes to the performance impact of all this. Can you give us a sense of what kind of difference we're talking about here?
Oh, absolutely. The numbers are really quite remarkable. So research shows that using CDNs like gstatic.com can lead to an average page load time reduction of 50 to 60%. That means that the websites and apps you use could potentially be twice as slow without it.
Wow, that's a huge GE difference.
It is. And that kind of speed has a direct impact on user experience. People are more likely to engage with content if it loads quickly. And they're less likely to abandon a page if they don't have to wait around for it to load.
Yeah, we've all been there, waiting for a page to load and just giving up out of frustration. It's also got to have a significant impact on how much data Google is transferring.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Think about the scale they operate at. Every little bit of efficiency adds up. So gstatic.com actually helps them achieve bandwidth savings of 40 to 60% compared to if they were serving all that content directly from their main servers.
That's going to translate to significant cost savings.
It does. It reduces their overall infrastructure needs and frees up resources for other things. And on a global scale, they see response time improvements of like 300 to 500 milliseconds. Now, that might not sound like much.
Well, it sounds pretty tiny when you say it like that.
I know, right? But in the world of web performance, milliseconds matter. And that improvement contributes to this feeling of speed and responsiveness that we all expect online.
It's like the difference between, I don't know, a smooth elevator ride and one that's jerky and slow. You might not be able to pinpoint exactly why one feels better, but you definitely notice the difference.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's the cache hit ratio, which is over 95%.
95%. That's incredible. What does that even mean, practically speaking?
So it means that more than 95% of the time, the static content that's requested is already sitting in a cache somewhere, whether it's your browser or an edge node. And it doesn't have to be fetched all the way from the origin server. So that's a huge efficiency boost. They also see a significant improvement in time to first byte, which is the metric for how quickly your browser actually starts to receive data from the server. On average, it's like 200 milliseconds faster with gstatic.com. And another interesting thing is that for text-based files like JavaScript and CSS, they achieve a resource compression ratio of 65 to 80%. So those files are significantly smaller when they're being transmitted.
So we're talking about like shrinking a file down to a quarter of its original size.
Yeah. And that makes a huge difference in how fast it can be downloaded.
It's clear that gstatic.com isn't just some little side project. It's a fundamental part of delivering the kind of web experience we've all come to expect these days. It makes things faster for us as users. But I imagine it also has some pretty significant advantages for Google on the back end. What are some of those operational benefits?
Yeah, there are a lot. For starters, they see a reduction of up to 80% in the load on their origin servers. And when you think about the scale of their operations, that's enormous. And it goes hand in hand with their 99.99% uptime guarantee, which means that their services are incredibly reliable. And, by distributing content across many different servers, they actually enhance security. And then, of course, there's automatic scaling. So as demand fluctuates, the system can adjust to handle it. And we've already touched on reduced infrastructure costs. So yeah, it's a win-win all around.
Wow, it's a pretty amazing set of benefits. Faster, smoother, more efficient, more reliable. It's pretty clear why they invested so heavily in this. And all of that translates to a better experience for us, right? Like you said, faster page loads, smoother interactions, fewer delays.
Exactly. And those little loading indicators that we all hate, you see those less often. And performance is more consistent across different devices, whether you're on a desktop computer or your phone. So yeah, the overall experience is just better.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit. I know some of our listeners might be wondering, why would I actually want to investigate gstatic.com more closely? Is this something I should be looking into? What kind of opportunities are there if I'm curious about how it all works?
Well, there are a few different angles to consider. One is performance analysis. gstatic.com is a real-world example of web optimization at a massive scale. So you could actually study how they do things, look at the techniques they use, and learn from the best.
So it's kind of like peeking under the hood of a high-performance car to see how the engine works.
Exactly. You could analyze their resource compression methods, their caching strategies, how they distribute content around the world. You could potentially learn a lot about how to improve the performance of your own websites and applications.
It's pretty cool. It's like having access to Google's web performance playbook. What about from a more purely technical research standpoint?
Well, yeah, you could delve into things like how CDNs are implemented at this scale. You could look at how they organize their resources. They have a huge collection of static assets. How do they manage all of that?
It's like a giant digital library. How do you keep track of everything?
Right. You could also investigate their version control system. How do they make sure that the correct version of a file is being served to users? It's a fascinating look into the architecture of a complex distributed system.
That sounds like a goldmine of information for anyone who's interested in building and maintaining large-scale web systems.
Yeah.
And it's not just for hardcore techies, is it? I imagine there's some interesting insights for businesses as well.
Definitely. From a strategic analysis perspective, businesses can actually learn a lot by studying Google's infrastructure.
So it's like competitive analysis.
Exactly. How does Google organize their resources? How do they think about content delivery? How do they optimize for performance across the globe? All those things can inform your own strategies for your online presence.
It's like looking at the best practices of a company that operates at a massive scale.
Yeah. And you could also use gstatic.com for performance benchmarking. You could compare the load times of your website to what Google is achieving, or see how effective your caching strategy is compared to theirs.
So it's not just about admiring Google's technology, it's about actually using it as a yardstick to measure your own performance.
Exactly. And you can also gain insights into resource optimization strategies, things like content compression, cache management, and load balancing techniques. They do all of that really, really well, and you can learn from that.
So it's not just about speed, it's about efficiency and using resources wisely.
Exactly. And it's also about operational insights. You can learn a lot by observing how Google manages traffic at scale, how they implement security, how they monitor performance. All of these things are valuable lessons for anyone running complex systems.
It's almost like getting a behind-the-scenes tour of Google's operations.
Right. And all of those observations can contribute to your own guidelines for how to do things better. How to deliver content more efficiently, how to improve caching, how to organize resources, how to optimize performance, and how to enhance security. It's a wealth of knowledge just waiting to be explored.
Now, I know some of our listeners are probably thinking, okay, that's all well and good, but can I actually mess around with gstatic.com? Can I, play around with the code? Can I scrape data from it? Our source material mentions web scraping in relation to gstatic.com. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, it's definitely something that people are curious about. And technically, yes, you can interact with gstatic.com programmatically. And our source material actually includes some Python code snippets that show you how to do that.
So you could potentially fetch content, download files, things like that.
Yeah, you could. The code uses libraries like requests and IOTTP, and it even shows you how to do things like asynchronous requests, which can speed up the process of retrieving data. And there's an example of how to use a library called rate limit, which is really important because it helps you avoid making too many requests too quickly.
Right, because you don't want to overload their servers.
Exactly. But it's really important to emphasize that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. And our source material is very clear about the ethical considerations involved here.
Yeah, it's like that old saying, just because you can't doesn't mean you should.
Exactly. So if you're going to interact with gstatic.com programmatically, you have to be responsible about it.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, for starters, always check and respect the robots.txt file. That's a file that websites use to tell automated tools which parts of the site they should and shouldn't access. So make sure you're not going where you're not supposed to.
It's like the rules of the road for bots.
Exactly. And you always want to implement rate limiting, like that code example we talked about. That makes sure you're not bombarding their servers with too many requests. It's also good practice to use appropriate user agents, which basically identify your requests so they know where they're coming from. And caching data locally is a good idea too. That way you don't have to make the same requests over and over again.
So it's about being a good citizen of the internet.
Right. And it's not just about ethics either. There are legal frameworks to consider as well.
Oh, right. So what are some of the legal things people need to be aware of?
Well, you have to comply with Google's terms of service, which likely have clauses about how you can and can't interact with their services programmatically. And depending on the type of data you're encountering, there might be data protection regulations to consider.
Like GDPR and stuff like that.
Exactly. And of course, you have to respect copyright laws and intellectual property rights. A lot of the content on gstatic.com is proprietary. So yeah, it's not a free-for-all. You have to be careful.
It sounds like if you're thinking about doing any kind of web scraping, you need to do your research first.
Absolutely. Understand the implications and proceed with caution. And, our source material also touches on some more advanced techniques that people might need to know about.
Oh yeah, like what kinds of things?
Well, for example, while gstatic.com is primarily about static content, sometimes you might encounter content that's loaded dynamically with JavaScript.
So it's not always as straightforward as just downloading a file.
Right. Our source mentions a tool called Selenium, which can automate browser interactions. That can be useful in those more complex scenarios where you need to interact with a page like a human user would.
So it's like having a robot browse the web for you.
Kind of. And then there are performance optimization techniques for your own programmatic interactions. Things like asynchronous requests, caching, reusing connections. All those things can make a big difference in terms of efficiency. But overall, it's important to remember that scraping gstatic.com directly is probably not something most people need to worry about. It's really more for very specific use cases.
Got it. So it's there if you need it, but proceed with caution. Now, one of the things I found really interesting in our source material was the community insights section. People shared their own real-world experiences and observations about gstatic.com. What were some of the things that stood out to you?
Oh yeah, that was a fascinating section. One thing that jumped out was the experience of people who use network-level ad blockers like Pi-hole. They found that when they blocked gstatic.com, it actually had a noticeable impact on some Google services, like images wouldn't load properly.
So it really does show how deeply integrated gstatic.com into the whole Google ecosystem.
Exactly. It's not just some standalone thing. It's a core part of how their services work. I also found it interesting that some people use gstatic.com for hosting landing pages on public Wi-Fi networks.
Wait, really? Like when you connect to the Wi-Fi, it's a coffee shop or a hotel?
Yeah. Apparently, it's pretty common to use gstatic.com to serve those captive portal pages where you have to log in or agree to terms of service.
Hmm. You know what? I think I have seen that before. It makes sense, though. They need a reliable way to deliver those pages, and gstatic.com is all about reliability and speed.
Exactly. And a lot of people in the community confirm that they've seen significant reductions in load times thanks to gstatic.com. So it's nice to have that real-world validation of the performance benefits we talked about.
Yeah, it's one thing to look at statistics, but it's another to hear from real people who are seeing the difference in their everyday browsing. The source also mentioned something about people getting 404 errors when they try to visit gstatic.com directly.
Yeah, that happens sometimes. People type in gstatic.com in their browser and they get an error message.
Yeah, why is that? It seems like it should just be a normal website.
Well, it's not really meant to be browsed directly. gstatic.com is designed to serve resources to other websites and services. It's not a website in the traditional sense.
Okay. It's like trying to enter a building through the back door.
Exactly. It's not how it's supposed to work.
So that's gstatic.com in a nutshell. A behind-the-scenes workhorse that powers so much of what we do online.
Yeah. It's an incredibly powerful and efficient system, and it's a great example of the kind of infrastructure that makes the modern web possible.
Absolutely. It's been fascinating to learn about. And it makes you think, what other seemingly invisible technologies are out there making our digital lives smoother and faster?
Yeah, it's a good reminder that there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
And for those of you who want to learn even more, we'll include links to some additional resources in the show notes. There's the Google Cloud CDN documentation, which goes into a lot of detail about how CDNs work, and the Chromium Development Guidelines, which are a great resource for anyone interested in web performance optimization.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.